All right, good afternoon, everyone. So it is now 2 o'clock Eastern Time. I'd like to go ahead and officially begin today's webinar. So thank you all again for joining us. So good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, OJJDP's FY18 Emergency Planning Demonstration Program, Applicant Orientation Webinar. Again, my name is William Moore, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a few minutes just to discuss a few features of Adobe Connect's webinar platform and provide a few announcements for us to keep in mind. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here, you will also find a FAQ for webinar participants that will likely address any technical related questions that you have. Click on the file name, then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type in your questions into the chat box as they arise. Those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. And I will give you all a few minutes to go ahead and type in any additional participants that you have joining you today. Thank you all for doing that. And of course, at the end of the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Finally, the webinar recording for this event will be archived in approximately 1 week on OJJDP's NTTAC YouTube channel, where you can also view additional training resources. Supported materials and the webinar transcript can be obtained by contacting OJJDP's TTA Help Desk. Again, thank you all for joining us today. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Gwendolyn Dilworth, with today's webinar. Gwendolyn, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, William. I'm looking forward to this presentation with you, and I plan to, there's a lot of information that we will be sharing, and I'll start with the goal of this webinar. Participants will understand the purpose, eligibility requirements, and application submission process for the OJJDP Fiscal Year 2018 Emergency Planning Program. Next slide, please. This webinar will consist of 3 parts, including presentation and discussion. Instead of waiting till the end of the presentation, because there'll be so much information presented to you, what we will do is divide the presentation and discussion into 3 parts. Part 1 will explore the purpose of the solicitation, eligibility requirements, project goals and objectives, and performance measures requirements. In Part 2 of this presentation, you will learn more about funding amounts, the length of the award, and budget submission requirements. In Part 3, we will review the application and submission requirements and the review process. Next slide, please. In 2009, OJJDP collaborated with several federal agencies and state, tribal, county, and local emergency management professionals to develop the emergency planning for juvenile justice residential facilities. This guide is referenced on page 5 of the Emergency Planning Demonstration Program Solicitation. The guide was based on an assessment conducted by OJJDP, which concluded that the specific needs of children, youth, and families in the justice system during an emergency were often a low priority in agency and emergency preparedness plans. Juvenile justice residential facilities are charged with the responsibility of safely detaining youth while providing them with vital services. Many youth in residential facilities, residential placement have a history of trauma and exposure to violence and are particularly vulnerable to the after effect of a major emergency. Emergencies such as hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, fires, floods, and tornadoes can occur at any time and anywhere. Juvenile justice residential facilities are required to have plans that enable their facility to prepare for, respond to, and recover from these emergencies to restore essential services and operations following an emergency. Well-developed and implemented plans enable residential facilities to protect the youth in their care, keeping families informed, supporting the staff who provide essential services, and ensuring continuity of operations for the community. In response, OJJDP will provide funding to support implementation of the principles outlined in the Emergency Planning for Juvenile Justice Residential Facilities Guide. Next slide, please. Program goals and objectives. This program will support the development, improvement, and/or implementation of emergency planning activities for state, tribal, county, and local juvenile justice residential facilities. In this section, you will be asked, applicants for this solicitation will be asked to describe the program's intent to change, reduce, or reduce the problem identified in the application. Next slide, please. As illustrated in this slide, emergency preparedness is a continuous cycle of planning, organizing, equipping, training, exercising, evaluating or monitoring, and taking corrective action. These activities are part of an ongoing cycle of improvement as coordination and planning partners assess the effectiveness of the facility's response to recent emergencies and make appropriate adjustments to enhance the management of subsequent emergencies. All emergency operation plans, also referred to as EOPs, are living documents. They change as new knowledge and regulations, staff changes, and other situations that planners face develop and evolve. Next slide, please. Important tips for emergency planning. We encourage all applicants to develop an all-hazards approach. We encourage collaboration with partners and stakeholders. This all-hazard approach ensures the best possible preparation for the full range of emergencies that can occur in juvenile justice facilities. Planning is most effective when it is coordinated with federal, state, county, and local juvenile justice agencies, as well as the state's emergency management planning, law enforcement, the courts, emergency medical services, human services, public health, fire, and public works departments, to name a few. This standard approach, also known as Incident Command System, or ICS, integrates the functions of facilities, equipment, procedures, and communications. Emergency preparedness should have at its center a written document that provides a tangible reference point for planners and for staff. Staff should be trained to respond to an emergency through regular drills. Plans should evolve as lessons are learned, new information and insights become available, and priorities change. Next slide, please. Emergency Planning Demonstration Program Objectives. Encourage the development or refinement of juvenile justice facility preparedness plans that address the principles outlined in the Emergency Planning for Juvenile Justice Residential Facilities Guide. Strengthen facility preparedness to manage the efficient continuation of operations and reduce the risk to the physical plant. Ensure the safety and well-being of youth and staff in juvenile justice residential facilities. You'll be able to find more information about these objectives on page 7 of the solicitation. In general, funds may be used to cover costs associated with ensuring that the facility is prepared to maintain efficient continuation of operations, the reduction of risk to the physical plant, and most importantly, the safety and well-being of youth and staff in juvenile justice residential facilities. Some examples of activities may include establishing and facilitating a planning team of juvenile justice facility staff and agency representatives, emergency management officials, medical and mental health experts, emergency medical service providers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, probation officers, juvenile and family court administrators, child welfare administrators, education partners, public works agencies, information technologists, and other key partners to design and implement the emergency plan. I'm sorry, I have interference on my slides. There, I think I got it. Conducting vulnerability assessments and identifying essential functions should also be included in addressing the objectives. Establishing agreements or contracts with organizations and professionals that can provide additional and necessary support during and following an emergency, including educators, such as educators, mental health professionals, and other support staff. Conducting assessments of facility and staff preparedness for an emergency, including review of communication procedures, facility functioning and staffing plans, and engaging youth, staff, family members in training for emergency preparedness, including cross-training, conducting drills, and exercises as appropriate, are all items that can be addressed through the objectives that you will be able to find on page 6 of the solicitation. Next slide, please. Evidence-based programs and practices. This solicitation encourages applicants to develop, refine, and or strengthen juvenile justice facility emergency preparedness plans that address the principles outlined in the Emergency Planning for Juvenile Justice Facilities Guide, because there is evidence that this approach is effective. You are not being asked to include a formal evaluation in your application. Selected applicants will be required, however, to collect data, as I indicated earlier, to show the progress of activities that will be reflected in the application. Next slide, please. Performance measures. There is further discussion on performance measures that you can find on page 14. Performance measurement is the regular collection of data to assess whether the correct processes are being performed and desired results are being achieved. It gives you a way to monitor your progress and to report that back to OJJDP. Specifically, it is a way to know how well a grant is progressing in meeting its goals and objectives as outlined in the application. The Office of Juvenile Justice Programs will require each successful applicant to submit regular performance data that demonstrate the results of the work being done under the grant. The performance data should directly relate to the goals, objectives, and deliverables identified under the goals, objectives, and deliverable section in the solicitation. But this is also located in Section A, Program Description. If your application is awarded, OJJDP will require recipients to submit semi-annual performance metrics that are relevant to the approved application. Please note, applicants are not required to submit performance data with the application. Performance measures information is intended as an alert that successful applicants will be required to submit performance data as part of the reporting requirements under the grant. In the last few pages of the solicitation, you will notice that there are pages marked performance measures, and it gives you a sampling of various measures that could be reported under this solicitation. You can find the performance measure table beginning on page 32. It goes from page 32 to page 34. So these measures are related to this particular solicitation. So you want to become familiar with that particular section so that you can understand what we will be looking for in terms of performance measurements as you begin to identify the measures that are related to your goals and objectives. Next slide, please. Who's eligible to apply? States, including territories, units of local government, federally recognized tribal governments as determined by the Secretary of the Interior, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, institutes of higher education, and just one final note, all recipients must forego any profit management fee. Those would be considered unallowable expenses. Next slide, please. Now, I know this was a lot of information to start off with, so I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask any clarifying questions about what I just said or what I just presented. So, William, if we have any questions, I'd be ready to answer.
Yes, sure. And just as a reminder to our audience, please utilize the chat pod that's located in the center of your presentation virtual room there to ask any and all questions that you have. I'll give you all a couple of minutes to go ahead and type in your questions, and I'll ask those to Gwen.
Okay.
And Gwen, it looks like people are typing, so I'm just giving them a few minutes to type their questions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, it looks like we have our first question. Can this funding be used to support unaccompanied, undocumented youth shelters?
And can they tell me a little bit, are these juvenile justice facilities? Are these youth who are in juvenile justice facilities?
All right, it looks like the individual who put up the question is clarifying, and they do indeed say no, Gwendolyn.
Okay, the funding for this grant is for youth who are already in juvenile justice delinquency, juvenile justice facilities. So I would say no to that particular question.
Okay, thank you. And again, everyone, if you have additional questions, please put them in the chat pod and we will respond accordingly. And our participant, Gwen, says thank you for that clarification.
Okay, thank you very much for the question.
All right, just giving folks just a few more minutes here to maybe ask any other questions. It looks like no one is typing right now, Gwendolyn, so we can give them a few more minutes, or if you'd like to proceed, then we can do so. Okay.
And then they'll have another chance. Well, actually, they'll have two more chances to ask questions. So if something, if you have a question that you felt might fit into this first section but didn't have a chance to ask it, there'll be two other chances to ask questions.
It looks like we may have one individual. Oh, nope, they stopped typing, so it looks like we don't have any other additional questions as of now.
Okay, then I'll go on to the next slide. In part two of this webinar, we'll look at federal award information, define what we mean by award type. We'll look at financial management and system internal controls and budget information. Next slide, please. Federal award information. First of all, the awards applications are due by April 16th. OJJDP expects to make between 4 and 7 awards. The awards will range from $50,000 to $150,000 per award. Awards will be made for a 24-month period. So awards that are made in 2018 will continue through 2020. The award period will begin October 1 of this year. At this time, OJJDP has no plans to provide additional funding under this solicitation. The total amount, estimated amount of funds available for this particular project is $350,000. Next slide, please. This award will be made in the form of a grant. Next slide, please. Financial management and system of internal controls. There's information on page 8 of the solicitation that discusses internal controls and segregation of duties. In short, it's important to be able to establish and maintain auditable accounting records, accurately account for federal funds if awarded, be able to account for federal funds separately from other grants and funding sources. Proper segregation of duties is a critical element of adequate internal control. Strong internal controls ensure effective and efficient operations, reliable financial reporting, and compliance with applicable federal laws and regulations. Next slide, please. Budget information. Clearly describe every category of expense that will be listed in the budget detail worksheet. OJP, the Office of Justice Programs, expects proposed budgets to be complete, cost-effective, and allowable. This solicitation does not require a match. Applicants should use the combined Excel-based budget detail worksheet and budget narrative, which is discussed in the application. You'll be able to go to a site, click on it, and fill it. It automatically adds up your columns, and it also includes a narrative section. So we really, really, really encourage people not to do a separate worksheet, but to use the one that is provided through the solicitation. However, we recognize that there may be some technical difficulties with the Excel version. So we also have a 508 compliant Adobe PDF version that can be downloaded and used to fill the budget information. So please use the forms that we have provided. If you're looking to purchase equipment such as phone radios or generators, those items must be itemized in the budget under proposed equipment. Next slide, please. Conference, meeting, and training costs. For a grant as small as this, particularly a grant as small as this, we encourage you to minimize conference, meeting, and training costs. But if you do have formal training included and the cost of that training exceeds $20,000, then prior approval from the Office of Justice Programs is required before dollars can be expended for a training of that type. For meetings and trainings in general, federal dollars cannot be used for beverages for lunch or for food, and that includes luncheon presentations. You can find additional information on the website reference that's at the bottom of the slide. You can review the checklist for additional clarification also regarding whether an event requires prior approval, and that link can be found in the DOJ 2015 Financial Guide, and that's one that you can Google. And I think there's a reference to it in the solicitation. Next slide, please. When you open the budget detail worksheet, you will notice the following categories: personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, other, and indirect. Your budget costs must align under the appropriate budget category. And you'll recognize that when you get to that budget detail sheet. But these are the categories that we use. Next slide, please. Over the years, we've seen a certain theme around budgets that don't get cleared. And so I thought I would share some of those with you so that you become aware of these things and can hopefully review your application to make sure that this does not happen to you. Reasons budgets don't get cleared is because incorrect computations are included. Unallowable costs are included. And what is allowable and is not allowable is discussed in the solicitation. Required cost breakdown by categories is missing. We need to be able to see your computations. So if you are requesting 5 phones that can be shared among various juvenile justice facilities, you need to say, the number of phones, the cost per unit. In the narrative, you need to explain how those phones are going to be used and how that's going to benefit operations at those facilities, and make sure that the totals add up, and talk about how the phones will be accounted for over the period of the grant. Another reason why budgets don't get cleared is narratives that are either incomplete or they're missing. The narrative describes the need for the item that's being proposed. Going back to the phones, perhaps the phones are for the director of the particular facility to be able to reach out to headquarters or to reach out to other members in the facility as a communication device. So it's, those kinds of things that need to be descriptive and need to be specific. Next slide, please. Other reasons why budgets don't get cleared. The accounting system and information capability questionnaire, also known as the FCQ, has not been submitted. This needs to be submitted with your application. And again, the information regarding where to go to get that form is in your application. On the next question, a federally approved indirect cost rate that's been negotiated, or the negotiated cost rate is outdated or has not been submitted. So if you are requesting indirect costs, please attach your federally approved indirect cost agreement with your application. It will save a lot of time as the application is processed, and if an award is made, the Office of the Chief Financial Officer will be able to review that more quickly. So please make sure that if you're going to request indirect cost rate, that the required information is attached. And finally, another reason why budgets don't get cleared is that responses to the initial budget financial review memo are insufficient. If additional information is needed, that can hold up review, or it could make the application, put the application in danger. So please, please make sure that all the questions are answered and the information is detailed and specific. Next slide, please. Okay, we have another opportunity for questions. If you have any questions regarding either the first section or this section of the presentation, I invite you to ask those questions.
Okay, Gwen, it looks like we had several questions to come in while you just presented your particular piece there. I wanted to go back because one individual did ask a question that pertained to the first part of your presentation.
Okay.
They wanted, yeah, so they said mentionly that, specifically that that you said that this was specifically for juvenile youth facilities, and so how could a nonprofit organization participate? Will we need to partner with a facility?
Yes, you would need to partner with, we have I can give you an example. We have one site that is a state-sponsored agency, but they have partnered with 22 facilities in the state. Some of those facilities are nonprofit facilities. So you would need to partner with anyone that I indicated in the beginning that are eligible applicants. If then, I know that nonprofit was in there. So as a nonprofit, if it's a juvenile justice detention facility, you are eligible to apply. But to strengthen your application, I would encourage you to partner with other facilities and other agencies. And again, let me just remind folks that the guide that we're asking you, please read the juvenile justice, the emergency planning guide, because that forms the basis for this solicitation. I hope that answers the question.
All right, let's see. We have another question that did come in. Could a proposal targeted to I'm going to rephrase this a bit so it can follow a bit clearer. Could a proposal that's submitted targeted to provide technical assistance to a juvenile justice facility to help them enhance their emergency preparedness plan? So could a proposal be submitted that is specifically to provide TA, technical assistance, to a juvenile justice facility to help them enhance their emergency preparedness plan?
States have worked with, the counties have worked with TA providers, but the facility is responsible for developing the emergency plan and identifying what their needs are. So a TA provider, again, must partner with facilities and become part of that strategy. But we have not funded TA providers to provide services to juvenile detention facilities. So again, I encourage them to partner with juvenile justice facilities, and they can contract with them to provide the training, but the training in and of itself does not stand alone.
Okay. Someone wanted to know, Gwendolyn, if the funding can be used to purchase vehicles.
I'm hoping that the vehicles are used as part of an overall strategy and not and is not the sole deliverable of the project. I know that a number of our juvenile justice facilities are in remote areas, and it's difficult to, would be difficult to move youth efficiently in an emergency. So if there is a strategic plan that justifies the need to purchase a vehicle or vehicles, and we'd need to, we would need to review the application. But again, let me just make sure I'm clear about this. The rationale for the use of vehicles would need to be embedded in an overall strategy to improve emergency services. So I hope that's clear.
Okay. The next question that we had, would travel to planning meetings for emergency preparedness purposes be covered by this grant?
It can be covered by the grant. Again, it depends on, what you're doing, what the overall strategy is, because if the purpose is to attend meetings of other partners in developing a strategy or enhancing an existing strategy or expanding partners who are involved in improving, I mean, that would certainly be a justified expense. But the application should describe what the goal of the strategy is and how that's going to enhance emergency services. Okay?
Okay. All right. All right. We have a few more questions to come in. And the next one, Gwendolyn, is it required to have two or to?
I'm sorry, William, you broke up. I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, I apologize. I'll repeat that. They wanted to know, is it required to have two or more entities to apply?
Okay, no, there's no requirement. OJJDP strongly encourages that you work with partners to accomplish this. So it is one of our objectives that, that partners be part of strengthening whatever focus this application will have.
Okay. Let's see. Another question came in, Gwendolyn, of an individual. He mentions that the last time that he asked his current OJP liaison about negotiating an indirect cost, that they weren't sure about how to go about doing that and wanted to see if you had any advice on that issue, and also if they wanted to use a de minimis rate, how do they establish that, like to let OJJDP, OJP, and the DOJ know about it?
Okay, an indirect cost can be established with any federal agency, particularly if you have funding from a federal agency right now. Often the most expeditious way of doing that is going to that federal agency and letting them know that you want to establish an indirect cost rate. It could be with the Department of Health. It could be with Department of Justice, Labor, any federal agency you can establish an indirect cost rate with. Each agency has its own procedures, so you may want to be in touch with the Office of Financial Responsibility for that particular agency. For OJP, that's the Office of the OCFO, Office of the Controller, and we have a help desk here for grantees who want to pursue that. Now, generally, it takes several months, particularly if you've never had one. It's a lengthy process, but it can be done. but it is not something that can be done in a month or two. It typically takes several months. In the meantime, any funds that have been requested for the use of indirect costs cannot be drawn down until there is an established indirect cost rate. Now, the second part of the question, in the financial, the OJP, the Department of Justice 2015 Financial Guide, there is a description of the de minimis requirements, and I think it's like 10% of the budget, but you would need to review that in the financial guide. And there are, again, there are strict details about that. And so those are the two requirements, and that's why usually if folks don't already have an ICR rate, we encourage them to allocate those funds in the approved budget categories that I showed in slide 26. So I know that was general, but I hope it was enough for the person who asked the question to review. So again, you can get an ICR rate with any federal government advisedly. A federal government that you already have a grant with, you go to their financial department, and every federal agency has an financial help desk, and they can guide through that process. The process takes several months to approve. And if there are indirect costs requested in the application, those costs cannot be drawn down until the agreement has been approved and we have it in our hands. If you submit an application that requests indirect cost rate, and for whatever reason that doesn't come through, you don't lose the funds. The funds then would be redirected by the grantee through a budget modification request into any of the approved budget categories that you saw on slide 26. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yes. So just to, another question came in, but I just wanted to clarify and let everyone know who may have been a little late that this webinar will indeed be provided on our on OJJDP's YouTube channel for those who are asking about the recording, and for all others who may have been a little late but asked about the PowerPoint or any associated information or resources, please note that that is indeed in the handouts pod located right above the chat pod. Just select on the file name, the name of the file, download it, and you'll have it directly to your laptop computer. Gwendolyn, there was a clarification that came in from an earlier question that you had pertaining to the vehicles. They just wanted to mention that they had regional emergency coordinators who might need to respond to a facility, and so they wanted to make sure that they would be able to purchase those vehicles for them to help with them to respond and to assess situations, basically.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And, you know, again, you can put that in the request. This is, you know, one of a type of application, you know, that where the explanation is really important. But even with the purchase of vehicles, the focus on coordination, what would coordination look like? You know, who is responsible for the vehicles? Who will have access to them? How will they be used for the kids and staff? That's the kind of background you want to build around a request such as that.
Okay, thank you, Gwendolyn. So we could go ahead and proceed. Everyone who asked those questions are basically typing back to you saying thank you for your clarification.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Are we ready for part 3?
Yes, ma'am. We're on the next slide.
Okay. I see time is catching up with us, and I want to make sure I get this information out to everyone because this is probably the guts of what you've been looking for during this process. So in the next few slides, we're going to examine how to apply for the application, the solicitation, what an application should include, evidence-based programs and services, what OJJDP is looking for, application review process and criteria, post-federal award deliverables, any additional attachments, and a preview of the grant life cycle. Next slide, please. To apply for this solicitation, you would first of all register and submit through grants.gov. Everything is going to go through grants.gov. There'll be full instructions on how to do that on pages 23 through 31 in your solicitation, and also toward the back in Appendix B, application checklist, pages 35 through 36. It will itemize each key portion that needs to be of information that the reviewers will be looking for, and it also has the page numbers where you go to find that information. So that checklist is a very important resource for you, and it can help guide you through the application, and it can also help you make sure that you have not missed any important information points. Next slide, please. What an application should include. The 424 is essentially the first sheet of your application. So you want to make certain that that is attached to the application. Another important sheet is your project abstract. Sometimes people forget to attach that, and that sheet is very important. It's a summary of your solicitation, what you plan to do, how you're going to do it, what you're hoping to accomplish, who are you going to serve. So it's, in about a paragraph or so, you will describe the intent of what you plan to do with this application. The program narrative details why you're applying for the application, the problem that you hope to address if you receive funding for this work. And there's more information about the statement of the problem on page 13 of the solicitation. Your goals, objectives, and how you're going to measure the effectiveness of what you've done. Those are key, of course, and I'll go through in a few slides later. I'll show you how those things measure up in terms of points and how they're counted. The project design and implementation, it lays out the strategy that you would use or applicants will use to implement this project. The logic model, you can view a generic model and timeline, and those are all featured in your in the solicitation. I'm going to go back to performance measures for just a bit. Please note that using terms like research and evaluation may trigger Department of Justice Human Subjects Protection regulations. However, data collection that is intended only to generate internal improvement to a program or service, which is what we're looking for, or are conducted only to meet OJP's performance measured data reporting requirements, which again is what we're looking for, most likely do not constitute research and should include sufficient information for OJP to determine whether the project proposed intends to use the data collected solely for the purpose of submitting the required OJJDP performance data. This is a critical distinction because there are additional requirements and special conditions that will be put on an award that uses terms like research and evaluation. And that is to ensure that persons who could be the subject, especially young people, who could be the subject of research and evaluation are protected, that their identities are protected. So if you use those terms, then expect that there will be additional requirements put on the grant. But if you're saying that, you know, we know that OJJDP and OJP is requiring us to submit performance data, then that's a different method of recording. So I'm, you know, just letting you know, be careful of the terminology that you use. We're not asking you to do research or evaluation for this particular solicitation. I mentioned the logic model a moment ago. The logic model is a useful way to illustrate how a project's performance measures are related to the specific problems or goals and objectives and design being proposed. By comparing the applicant's logic model with OJJDP's logic model for the program under which the application is being made, the applicant can, one, ensure that the goals being proposed for the solicitation excuse me, correspond with OJJDP's. Two, that you select indicators that will provide useful performance data for your program. So that's the value of using the logic model. Next slide, please. What an application should include, additional things, capabilities and competencies. What strengths do you bring to work like this? You know, what's your experience? Who will be working on the project? The budget detailing worksheet, I discussed that in detail. I mean, that is another important critical point to your application. Describing proposed subawards, anybody you plan to subcontract out some of the work. So like the city may apply for a grant, but then they may give the award to a nonprofit, to other government-funded juvenile facilities. And then pre-agreement costs, I'm going to refer you, because of the time, to the solicitation for further information on that, because that's discussed in detail. Next slide, please. The indirect cost agreement, I've discussed that, and the financial, the FCQ, I've discussed that. Disclosure of lobbying activities, I'll just say that that's a form that you need to make sure is included in the application. Additional attachments, you need to write a statement on pending applications stating that anything you do with this award is not being replicated with other funding to do the same thing. So we want to make sure that that these funds are being used to enhance other areas and not being funded by another agency to perform the same tasks. Okay, next slide. The review process. OJP is committed to a fair and open process. We use peer reviewers to review the applications once they meet the basic minimum requirements. One, they're submitted by an eligible applicant. We reviewed that in the earlier slide. The funding request falls within the range of funding constraints. I reviewed that when we talked about the type of award. The application is responsive to the solicitation scope. I shared the goal and the objectives in the intent of this award. The applicant is not identified in SAM as excluded from receiving federal awards. You can find out more information about SAM on pages 24 and 25 of the solicitation requirements, but I also need to tell you that SAM registration is required to submit your application. SAM is one of the first things you want to do because it can take up to 10 days to get the system for award management, which is SAM. It's a repository of certain standard information about federal financial assistance, applicants, recipients, and sub-recipients. So it has information about, it will explore information about the applicants. So you want to make sure you do that as one of the first things to complete. And understand, even after you fill out the application, which can take 10 business days, it can take another 48 hours for that information to transfer from SAM to grants.gov. So we're talking about 12 days just to get SAM up and transferred so that you can then focus on your application. Next slide. The application review requirement includes a statement of the problem that's counted as 20% of your application. Goals, objectives, and performance measures count 5%. The project design and implementation discussion counts as 45% of your grant. Capabilities, your description of your capabilities and competencies that demonstrate that you are able to manage and accomplish this award, if awarded, is 20%. The budget is 10% of the review criteria. And again, on this slide, you can see what we will be looking for moving forward. The grant life cycle, real quickly, you're in the pre-award phase. You've identified this as a funding opportunity, and I've described now the application review process. If awarded, decisions and notifications will be sent to those who receive awards and those who didn't receive awards. The post-award phase focuses on implementation of the application that is by this time approved by OJP through the closeout process. So this, in short, is that report. Next slide, please. Additional information on this grant can be, or questions can be sent to grants@ncjrs.gov. If you also have additional grants, you can contact grants.gov customer support, and that email is located on the third line here where it says support at grants.gov. There's also a hotline number, a couple of numbers that you can call if you have further inquiries about the grant. And William, I know we're over time. I don't know if we can take a few more questions.
Yeah, sure. And just a reminder to folks, we are over time. However, if you do need to exit, this webinar is being recorded and will be placed on our YouTube page that I will show in just a few slides. But if you do have questions and you have time to stay over, please feel free to ask them in the chat pod, and I'll give you guys a couple of minutes just to ask your questions. And Gwendolyn, I want to check with you. Are you available to stay on for a couple of more minutes for those who may have just a few questions about Part 3?
Yes, I am. I'm available.
Okay, great. It looks like we have at least one individual typing right now, and so I'll wait for them to type. But just again, I wanted to remind everyone, handouts are located for today in the handouts pod. You can download them there. And if you do need to jump off, we will have this recorded and placed on our YouTube channel. So the question that just came in, it looks like they wanted to know what is the lowest grant amount being offered. I know you covered that in a previous slide, so they may have missed that from Part 1.
Yeah, the grant range is $50,000 to $150,000.
Great, thank you.
And if people have to jump off, if I could just say too, I want to thank everyone who participated in this. I know it was a boatload of information, but it's information that is important, and I appreciate your patience with it. And I just want to thank you for your interest and your involvement.
Additional questions coming into the chat pod here, so if you'd like to proceed, we can maybe move forward with wrapping everything up. Okay. Okay.
I don't have anything further to add, maybe except for this. If you have questions, we do have an agency that will be handling those questions, and I encourage you to contact, again, the Response Center at grants.gov, customer service, or call the customer service hotline at the 800 number that's listed on your slides, and the 606 number that's also available. And these persons will do their best to respond to any other questions you may have. Thanks, William.
All right, so just a last few little bit reminders here, and thank you again, Gwendolyn, for this great discussion on this topic. Just a few brief reminders for folks. The recording for this event will be archived on OJJDP's NTTAC YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is located here, and then access to that channel is also located in the slides that's in your PDF. And of course, if you all have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact the OJJDP NTTAC Help Desk at OJJDP@USDOJ.gov. Also, if you need to contact OJJDP, here's our contact information on the next slide, where we will provide to you our email address, and where we also have the website for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. And we also have our Facebook page. And if you have, of course, additional questions, the email is support@grants.gov. And finally, just wanted to show this slide so that everyone can see this information that we have here, but wanted to remind everyone finally that we do have our online evaluation. We would greatly appreciate that if you take just a few minutes to please take about 5 minutes to fill out our evaluation and provide us some feedback as well. So again, thank you for everyone who joined us this afternoon. We appreciate you for taking the time out, and have a great and wonderful afternoon. Thank you and goodbye.
William?